what we do, open mat. For those of you that don't know, I'm a jiu-jitsu instructor, a martial arts teacher. You have classes in jiu-jitsu, right? Like I go teach every Wednesday night, every Thursday night, I teach class. I have a lesson, I have something that I'm going to teach, and then I go to class and I teach it. Every now and then, like usually once a week or sometimes after class, we have what's called open mat. Open mat is a time where there's no set curriculum. There's no structure. The instructor's there, the students are there, people just come and it's just kind of this free training time. Like you get to just train together. You get to workshop stuff. You get to try things that you want to get better at. You get to ask questions. You get to get feedback. It's just that's what it is. The mat is open and there's no set schedule. So that's what I've always envisioned open mat to be at Disciple Dojo. I've always envisioned this much smoother than this that's happening, but a time where Dojo viewers could just come and ask questions and could talk about something and we can, just have a little bit of back and forth. So that's the purpose. I am going to be monitoring the comments here on YouTube, and I'm going to take questions as they come in. Now, guys, listen, and I just want you to know up front, if I don't know the answer, I'm going to tell you my initial thoughts and then maybe try to point you to someone else or some other resource out there that can help you. Some questions, you should know off the bat, I'm not a preacher. I don't have a church. I was born in a preacher household. My dad's still is a preacher. He's coming up on over 50 years. I have been in and around ministry. I've been on staff at a church. I have preached, but I am more in the Bible nerd wheelhouse, biblical theology, biblical scholarship, predominantly Hebrew Bible. So sometimes if you ask me like a specific question about the synoptic gospels, I'm not going to be able to rattle it off the cuff as gracefully as some preachers might be able to. So just all that in mind, let's talk about the questions that you guys have. David Rogers says, question, is there any fiction in Scripture? I think there's at least one fictional story, and it must be fiction or we can't interpret anything. There's a lot of fiction in Scripture. All of Jesus's parables were fiction. Now, you're going to have more questions when people say, okay, what about things that don't necessarily say that they are fiction, but the genre points us in that direction? That's where, let me spit my gum out, by the way. I just realized I still have my gum in. That's where you're going to find disagreement among biblical scholars, among preachers, among theologians. They're going to wonder, okay, for instance, a book like Jonah. Is Jonah historical? Is Jonah fiction? The problem that we have is when somebody says fiction, we immediately think untrue. And that's just an incorrect dichotomy. There are books like Jonah, like Job. Some have even suggested Esther are to a good degree what we today modern would call fictitious. Others might call like embellishment or something maybe rooted in some history, but with fictitious elements. I don't have a problem if somebody suggests that something in Scripture is fiction. I want to ask them, why are you suggesting that it's fiction? So, for example, Jonah. Let's talk about Jonah because I love teaching on Jonah. It's one of my favorite books. It's my favorite of the minor prophets. Is Jonah fiction? If somebody says yes, I will ask them, why do you say that? If they say, because we know a person can't live inside of a fish for 3 days. Okay, that's not a good reason to call something fiction. You're using a anti-supernaturalist grid as your means of determining whether something's fiction or not. It doesn't work that way. But if somebody says, well, Jonah has a lot of the characteristics of the fiction genre or other passages or other writings from the ancient world that are fiction, that we know are fiction, that we don't have a problem saying are fiction, Jonah has a lot of those. And so literarily, it reads more like one of Jesus's parables in extended form than a historical play-by-play account of an actual event. That's a different argument. That's an argument that I can say, okay, I could see that. There's validity. I'm not saying yes or no at this point. I think I've heard good arguments for Jonah being largely historical, and I've heard good arguments for Jonah being a prophetic parable, using figures in the world like Ninevites and Prophet Jonah, who did exist. So to me, that's where there's a little bit of freedom, and we got to stop this kind of reactionary, like as soon as somebody's like, well, maybe this is fictitious. Oh, whoa, 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 whoa. Like this week, I'm going to be having Dr. Mike Licona on the channel. We're going to be talking about his book, Jesus Contradicted, and handling contradictions in the Synoptic Gospels. And Mike got in, ruffled feathers at the Evangelical Theological Society. This was probably 10 years ago. It's been a while, when he suggested that the passage in Matthew, and only in Matthew, where at the crucifixion, Matthew puts this very, by any estimation, bizarre account of the tombs opening up and the bodies, people coming out of the tombs and appearing to many in the holy city. It's this very strange, like, little section. And what he and many, many other gospel scholars have suggested is that there is something that Matthew is doing that is not straight eyewitness accounting of an event to be read in chronological order, but that this section is, and I don't remember exactly how Licona described it, but others have talked about like a mini element of apocalyptic being placed at a key moment theologically in Matthew's gospel. And so would it be part of Matthew's gospel, and would it be like events just playing as they happened? Well, Licona argued no. And because of that, you had people like Norm Geisler and others rallying to get him kicked out of the Evangelical Theological Society. Just insanity, because he was daring to make a genre-based literary exegetical argument that had no bearing on the truth of the gospel or the factual nature of the resurrection or anything like that. So I say all that to say, we got to do better than being so hyper vigilant before we hear somebody's argument. Now, if we hear somebody's argument and they're like, well, the Exodus is fiction, it didn't really happen. Well, why do you say that? Well, because, archaeology, we don't really find it. And come on, you can't, like, God could split the Red Sea and all. I just feed people in the desert for 40 years with manna. It's got to be fiction. No. All of Scripture is predicated upon the miraculous. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If God can create the universe, then miracles aren't a problem. That is a bad reason to suggest something is fictitious. Archaeological evidence is a bad reason. Archaeological evidence is inherently piecemeal. It's inherently subjective. It is not a hard science. When you try to get down into specific historical events, it can only give you the basic skeletons of things. So for those reasons, that's when I think it's warranted to go, no, that's not a good argument for why something's fiction. But for, literary, grammatical, exegetical arguments, yeah, I think that's fair game. Long answer to a good question. Angela C. says, Jonah is in the prophets, not the wisdom literature, and Jesus talks about him. Does this change the argument? 3 big red question marks. Okay. No, Angela, I don't think it does change the argument. Jesus talks about him because Jonah was a real person. And the argument is not that Jonah, the prophet, son of Amittai, was not a real person. We know he was because he's mentioned in the historical books. The argument is, did the book of Jonah, did those events happen, or is that a tale based on a historical encounter that the prophet Jonah had, but not specifically giving play-by-play? So no, I don't think it changes the argument. And we also want to be careful, when Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah, he's talking about the sign in the book of Jonah. He's not saying the sign of Jonah, who was a literal person who literally, this happened exactly as his book described. You can just mention a story. You can mention a character in a story without saying one way or the other the historistic value of that story. So I don't think it changes the argument.